ageing, but in possibly a bit of a discursive way. And the reason I'm going to do that is I think it's that we often create a disjuncture between sustainability, which is often around environmental outcomes, and our other outcomes that we want in the social and economic sphere. And what I want to do is, I guess, try and put those together a little bit more. And in particular start thinking about cities again as really having two defining characteristics in New Zealand. I don't think these are inevitable. I think they're very contingent on what we have in New Zealand. One is that they are environmentally unsustainable in New Zealand, and they're demographically dysfunctional, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. But the worst thing that we really have is not what the cities do now, but what towns and cities, I think, in New Zealand we should really say, but what they're going to do for us in the coming years, given the big changes that we're facing in New Zealand. And they are threefold, I think. One is the structural ageing thing. I'm very concerned about personal ageing at the moment because I feel older and older, and indeed am. But the other thing that is technology, so. The other thing that's really important, though, is the way in which the population is changing. The structure of our society is ageing, and that has some really important implications. It's particularly important when we have a society that's also experiencing a 10-year revolution, which I'll talk about, and we've also developed in the last 20-odd years what I would call completely unaffordable built environments. That was incipient, I think, emerging prior to the 1990s, but since the 1990s that's really taken off. So just particularly there'll be lots of experts here around environmental threats, environmental problems around cities, but I just want to remind you of our cities inevitably degrade and deplete things. The problem is whether we get a net benefit from those or it's a net cost. And they degrade and deplete our soils, and we haven't got very many really good soils in New Zealand, surprisingly enough, and they're increasingly under buildings. They degrade very fragile economic systems, particularly around wetlands, coastlands, riparian verges and so forth, and that's associated with water degradation, but also, of course, through stormwater, but also through sewage and so forth, which is about coming together and using water and using it to dispose of our waste, as well as air quality. And of course cities are carbon hungry, and there's a thirst for expansion of cities and the footprint of cities in New Zealand rather than the retrofitting of cities. We have this idea that we can just pack up and go somewhere else, usually into the green fields. Now, in shifting cultivation, when I was a young sociologist being taught by anthropologists, so shifting cultivation was a big thing that we learnt about, and that was where you cultivate for a while, you pack up everybody, and you move on and you cultivate somewhere else, and you let the ecological system that you've depleted behind you to recover. Cities don't do that. They just let them become, the bits that we've used become derelict and dilapidated. And so what you see in some cities is shelling out of cities and a sort of effect of a cheese effect where you've got lots of holes. But they're already depleted, degraded and already in decline holes rather than somewhere that you can go back to. And you can see that in Christchurch. And in fact, being in Christchurch, what you saw in Christchurch is really the earthquake did pretty much what already was happening in Christchurch, which was shelling out the centre city, allowing that to decline, allowing the enormous resource that it used to be built in the first place to be shelled out and effectively wasted. The thing that we have a real issue, I think, in New Zealand is that we have a very complex population. And that's one of the things that we don't often recognise in New Zealand, and we need to recognise it a lot more. And there's two things, I think, that indicate the complexity around the demographics of our population. One is the old age dependency ratio, and I keep using it because that is the technical term, even though I hate it, which is people 65 plus and their relationship and ratio to people who are 15 plus to 64, who are assumed to be in the labour market. Now we know that doesn't work very well in New Zealand because we have still difficulties in getting our young people employed, but nevertheless it gives you a sense of it. And what you see on this graph is the age dependency ratio according to our regions, and you can see the oldest one is that big red one to your right. She says, she's making sure she's got it. Your right, which is Marlborough, which actually looks more like France and Italy than it does like Auckland, which is the other red one on the left of that graph for you. And you can see that some areas in New Zealand are actually ageing quite quickly. But the thing to remember is even where those areas are ageing quickly, Marlborough again is the little tiny one on the right there may not be that many older people. But at the place that isn't ageing quickly because of the ethnic demography of that city is Auckland, which is that great big red one, because there's a lot of older people there, even though the age dependency ratio is relatively low. And that presents us with a particular problem about not taking one sort of measure to think about how you need to build and manage and retrofit your cities. And essentially, irrespective of our age dependency ratios, irrespective of the numbers of older people that we have in our different regions, we have what I would call demographic dysfunction. And there's a couple of things I just want to highlight about what I mean that, what I'm referring to when I think about that. And one parameter of that is the problem of car is king. It effectively excludes now and will continue to exclude older people. By 2051 there'll be over 300,000 older people in New Zealand who will be unlicensed. They will not be able to drive a private car, well indeed any car actually, they won't be driving buses over. They won't be driving. You may think, oh, you know, Uber and driverless cars is the solution to that. That brings its own problems, and I think it's an interesting area. But the other thing that, of course, when you have a city which is, and a town which is very based in our provincial towns are in many ways worse than our cities around public transport and access to public transport, you also exclude and restrain and constrain children and young people as well. So this is not just about old age versus young age, it's about how you deal and get cities that actually work for the different ages. And of course what happens with the car as king is that it tends to undermine public transport networks, which then gets used to argue that there is no taste for public transport. One of the arguments that in Auckland for many, many years is that people just don't want public transport, they all like driving their car. And you say, well, does that mean that someone in Auckland is fundamentally different from someone in Wellington? Because they're all trying to use the public transport, thank you very much. Are they genetically different somehow? How does that work? Somebody says, I shouldn't have gone down the genetic difference things. Got to remember there are many Wellingtonians in Auckland. They're the ones that don't like using public transport, obviously. No. What happens, of course, is that we attenuate our travel times and our travel distances, and our infrastructure becomes attenuated and costly. We have big roads, big drains, big stormwater, big sewage systems, which all are connected with this idea that you can keep going out and out and out. And we often then expose young and old people, street users, pedestrians in particular, to risk. I'm just going to come back to driving addiction in a second. I just want to show you this. One of the things that we do in New Zealand is that we pitch generations against each other. But if you look at this particular thing, can I get a little dot here? Yes, I can. This to me tells you about the connections between age groups, not the differences. Look at these two bulges. Here's the older age groups, and here's the younger age groups. So those two groups actually become highly at risk when we have a car-dominated city structure. So this is not about changing things because we are old, it's changing cities to actually meet the needs of our population wherever they are in terms of the life course. The trouble with our driving addiction, and we have it, is that we have a whole lot of things that happens to cities and district plans. Over provision of parking on site and garaging is given a great deal of attention in most district plans, so they have to be on site rather than off. That increases housing building costs and land costs, development costs and so forth. We have the under provision and maintenance of footpaths. If anyone's walked along a footpath, that they know this is not good for people. That's part of the reason, because we're spending a lot of time patching very wide roads and not very much time on very narrow footpaths. And of course, ultimately, we're also going to get the mobility scooter footpath racer phenomenon, which is probably not such a risk in Wellington, but it's certainly a risk in Blenheim, where I live just outside of Blenheim, which has got one of the highest densities of mobility scooters in the country. And we've also had a number of people who have had fractures from a collision with mobility scooters, with pedestrians and so forth. So we now have a whole sort of drive your mobility scooter responsibility view. The other problem for New Zealand, of course, is that our cities, although they contain most of our housing stock, contain a stock which actually doesn't work very well for us, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. And Philippa's works and Nigel, where is he? Nigel Isaac's works, and many of you probably have been involved in looking at housing. The real problem, I think, about housing and new builds, it lies in new builds and our lack of renovation to make our housing accessible and functional. We renovate to make it look nice. We're very good on fashion, but we're not so good on performance. And one of the reasons for that is that our building code actually doesn't highlight things like accessibility and functionality. And anyhow, the industry actually struggles to meet code. We often put our new builds in environmentally fragile and risky spaces. There are systemic problems that we have in our buildings which lead to insecurity and dependence where people won't be. Leaky building condition, for instance, the impacts of that have fallen most on older people, because they're the people that bought in the 1980s, in their 50s. They're now looking down the barrel of some big repair work. People that we could have expected as the public not to need our support are probably now going to need it, because they cannot afford to remediate their homes. And of course, we also have the problem of overproduction for wealthier segments of the market and high-income households. Just to give a few ideas of the way in which our housing stock within cities has sort of left behind what we need. This is the age dependency ratio again in the orange. And the blue line is the percentage of stock added since 2001 that's 1 or 2 bedrooms. And you can see it's quite an interesting opposite. In Marlborough we're doing incredibly badly, less than 5%, it's not because we're not building. Auckland's doing quite well actually, and that's almost entirely because of retirement villages and apartments and student accommodation. The overproduction for the wealthy is indicated in 2 places. One is the spread of retirement villages, and there's a real issue there about oversupply of retirement village spots rather than undersupplied. People think it's going to be undersupplied, but actually it's not. And in fact, in the last year, Somerset, for instance, has seen a 21% decrease in its sales, both new and resales of licensed to occupiers. But more importantly, and importantly, not more importantly, and importantly, where we've pitched our new builds has been at the upper end of the market, not the lower end of the market. So in the 1960s, 35% of new builds were in what we call the lower quartile of value. That's the 25% of value at the bottom of 100% profile. By 2003, that was down to 8%, and 40% of the new builds were up in the top quartile of value. And so that's a really important change. And associated with that, we have a declining investment in the rental stock. That's the decline that you can see in investment in public housing between 1996 and 2013, and some people would say that that underestimates the decline because it was already declining in 1996 quite rapidly. And this shows you the building quartile of value profile. The two things to look at are the this blue line coming down here, that's the lowest quartile. That was the quartile that most people went into for their first homes. And this is the upper quartile, the upper 25% of value here. This has nothing to do with price, I might point out, because the quartile is about the relationship with the whole 100%. It's not about the particular price of these things. So essentially, cities have become unaffordable, and there's a huge amount, cities have actually been complicit in price driving. And price driving, in terms of housing price, creates all sorts of problems for older people. But also, it has to be said, for young families who already have significant sort of significant commitments outside their housing. Rate stress is one. We decouple the value of a house from its condition and its performance. There's a valuation addiction among local authorities, so that's the only way they can get money in. So it actually, for local authorities, higher valuations is a good thing because that's their revenue stream. And industry and household addiction to windfall gain, which you get from doing nothing, but just by the paper change in your housing's value. And that's reflected in a whole lot of things about changes in tenure, concentrations of ownership and land hoarding, and a sort of sense, too, that in fact it feeds intergenerational conflict. And one of the big things that you see in cities is the inability for young and older people to talk together. I think there is only one local authority I'm aware of that formally has its older people's forum talk with its younger people's forum, and they do so on a very regular basis, and it's one of the tiniest local authorities around. And the reason, of course, we've become addicted and councils have become addicted to high house prices because we had this big step change in the 1990s. Suddenly, house prices, which just diddled along, suddenly went whoops, like this. Doesn't matter where you were. Could be in Dunedin, could be in Auckland, could be in Wanganui. You see it in Wanganui here. Where is Dunedin? Here. Of course, in Auckland and Wellington, Wellington and what was Manukau, that's kept on going. It's kept on taking off. Elsewhere, it sort of stopped again. Why has that happened? Probably a flush of liquidity to the banks coming in from international markets in the 1990s. But the outcome of that is the psychedelic problem. And the psychedelic problem is that while if you were born in 1927, here we are here, by the time you were 60, 64, 87% of people, not dwellings, would actually be in home ownership. And here we've got this cohort here, which is 1942. At the same period, only about 60% are. And we can expect that home ownership to keep on going down. And that's a hugely rapid fall in New Zealand. And that means some real big changes for New Zealand. And it means also that there is an exclusion in our cities between those that can go into home ownership and those that are stuck in rental. For older people, what it means is that there's an idea, because they tend to be in home ownership, is that they're on the pig's back and they're excluding younger people. But in fact, that's not how prices really work. And in fact, if you have a look at these sorts of graphs, I'm not going to talk about it at length, but if you have a look, these are repeat sales of a particular house over a period of time. And you can see, while there's this sort of discourse that house prices are going up and older people have got all this equity that they can pull out of it and spend on the grid life and so forth, actually, there's quite a lot of differentiation in terms of the equity that you can actually get out of house prices over periods of time. So, you know, you have to be quite lucky to get significant equity out. The problem that comes out of that is that we get inertias in the flow of housing throughout the city. And that flow, which typically we would hope would allow some houses to be opened up and young families to go into those and older people choosing elsewhere or finding ways of using their housing more efficiently, tend not to happen within our cities. And that's because downsizing for owner-occupiers is actually quite difficult. A, there's not the stock, and B, there's very little low-cost housing available. If you're in a high-priced market, you sell high, but you also have to buy high. And a smaller dwelling doesn't necessarily mean a less costly dwelling, and in fact in some markets quite the opposite. And so there's relatively little capital release, even when people degrade their tenure. And I can see Philippa just looking slightly anxiously at right, so I'm going to whip on quickly here because I know I'm going over time. The alternative, of course, for people if they can't get into home ownership, young and old, and older people in particular, is rental. And actually, the rental market loves older people because they think they're not, you know, cooking up peanut in the backyard and things, which I don't think is true because I think there's going to be a whole flush of chemistry students that have got free education in the 60s and 70s and are now going to flow into the rental market. And they're well sorted in terms of the, you know, cooking up of stuff. But the problem for older people is that we have a rental market which is treated as though it's a residual rental market when it no longer is a residual rental market. And a residual rental market means that it's only there for a temporary period of time, short periods of time for most people, if at all, and or it's only for a very small group of people. But actually we now increasingly large numbers of people, by certainly within the next few years, at least 50% of the housing stock in New Zealand is going to be rented. And what a residual rental market means is it tends to be lightly regulated, so you get a lot of stock churn, you get a lot of price pressure, and also for older people there's age-related eviction, something that happens to young people as well, but for different reasons. And so people are sort of concerned, landlords sort of say, well, they can't do the garden anymore. Well, they've started to act a bit peculiarly. They must have dementia, so we'll get them out there before they do something. They've probably got a urinary tract infection, actually, but, you know, never mind, it's not go there. So there's a whole lot of problems around the rental alternative for older people, including the use of online application now. And so the digital divide between older and younger people really starts to play out in access to rental housing. And then, of course, is the affordability market. And older people, like young people, are dependent on the private rental market. They're not dependent on council housing or HNZC. It's the private rental market they live in, and their rents are essentially unaffordable. So that gives you an idea of what's affordable rent for older people living alone and couples, and you can see that these are the lower quartile median rents in a few places in Wellington region. Where there are gaps on that table, it means that there has been no recent availability of houses in those stocks. So essentially what I think we need to be thinking about is moving our cities from a vicious city to a virtuous city, a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing I think we need to get away from is the idea that both housing and ageing are wicked problems, and therefore they're terribly difficult and unable to be resolved. They are wicked problems in the sense that they're multifaceted, but they also provide some awesome opportunities that we can think about. And the resolutions, I think, lie in some very opaque stuff, which you say, oh, that's not very practical. But the things between thinking about the difference between taste and preference and addiction. A lot of what we do and we get out of markets in New Zealand is because it's supply driven and we're addicted to it. It's not because we like it, It's because that's all the supplier's going to do. So if you can't get good home bake in Christchurch anymore, it's because your supplier has decided not because you've changed your taste. And it works the other way around too, and that's exactly what happens with our housing. The second thing is that we need to really be serious about understanding the apparent and the real costs of age exclusionary and versus age-friendly environments. And it's something that Philippa and we were talking about in a meeting for the housing program the other day, where we all were metaphorically striking our heads upon the wall saying, why is it that officials say to us there is no data about the benefits of insulation or accessible housing or compact cities? Actually, there's a bomb of information out there. So why isn't it getting through? Well, we need to take our data serious, we need to take evidence serious, and we need to listen to it. Not saying that everything isn't evidence, but that it is there, should not be ignored. We need to recognise that there is an embedded contradiction in our cities. One is that where cities fail, the costs of that tend to fall on the most vulnerable and the most at risk. The contradiction is that we're all in this together. So if the nest gets shattered, everyone in the nest will get affected eventually. Might be able to climb up onto the edge of it for a while, but sooner or later it will get you. So let's forget about our own dunghill for a while and think about the whole. And then finally, I think it's more than a triple bottom line. It's not about environment and social and economic as separate things, but given somehow some accounting recognition. There is a mutual synergy, there's a mutuality about some of the things that can be done. And so in terms of the interweaving of age and environment, the best thing that we can do is actually get intergenerational flows throughout our cities, because that's how generations learn to live within the city and its environmental limits, as well as re-share the resources in the city. We need an age-friendly housing stock, not just because we've got a whole lot of older people, including me, that we need to be careful when going up and down stairs, but because actually it works for everybody. There's no reason to think. I can't think of any age-friendly housing that doesn't work for both older and younger. It's a lifetime thing. We need to be thinking about much more diversification in terms of the types of buildings that we have, and that relates to tenure diversification rather than neutrality, and I won't go into that. We need to think much more about compact and connected towns and cities. That's absolutely critical for everyone. And the two big things that we need to recover from is our addiction to the car, and secondly, our addiction to house prices. So if you're a homeowner and you get your latest valuation in, which I did only 2 weeks ago, and my little heart went, oh, that's lovely, my valuation's got up. I should have been thinking, oh, bloody hell, that's my rates have just gone up, and how am I going to afford that? That addiction is a really bad addiction. It's something that cities have to think about, local authorities have to think about. How do we break this? Because we actually have a structure which makes us all complicit, except for those that are excluded, and there'll be increasing numbers of those in this idea that we want higher house prices, etc., etc. So we might complain about them on one hand, we might worry about our grandchildren in relation to them, but there's a whole lot of players that are actually addicted to them, and a whole lot of suppliers who are ready to feed that addiction. So anyhow, that's all I have to say.